This has to end. It's a national embarrassment. It is a national embarrassment what's going on. And it's not only these mass shootings that are occurring. Every single day, there's a mass shooting in the United States if you count all those who were killed out on the streets of our cities and our rural areas. It's a national embarrassment and must come to an end.
Hopefully we'll all agree it's a national embarrassment, but who believes among us that there is a will to really, at this point, bring this to an end? That was President Biden, of course, the day after the latest mass shooting in America, 8 people killed within a matter of a few minutes at a FedEx facility in Indianapolis late Thursday night. Now we are learning more about the shooting as well as the shooter. The 19-year-old gunman killed himself on the scene, and now we know he legally purchased the rifles that he used that day. But if Indiana had stricter gun laws, or the ones that are on the books were actually more closely followed, this tragedy could have possibly been averted. I'm referring specifically to red flag laws, which are in place in more than a dozen states, including New York and California. But their conditions, they vary widely. In California, family members, they can directly petition to have firearms seized from someone in their family if they pose a danger to themselves or others. But in Indiana, law enforcement alone has the authority, and a judge has to get involved as well. And in the case of the Indianapolis shooter, we know the police took a brand new shotgun from the teenager last year after his mother called to tell them that he wanted to use it on himself. But apparently police didn't take it any further. Then, just 4 months after his gun was seized, he bought a rifle. Then 2 months after that, he bought another. Those were the guns that he used last week. Now, the gun violence epidemic, it is causing another crisis in this country. Countless children who survived the shootings either at home or at school or in public, only to suffer PTSD and other emotional problems in the aftermath. And my next guest, he wrote a new book focusing on that. It is called Children Under Fire, an American Crisis. Author John Woodrow Cox, he joins us now. Thanks for the time.
Hey, thank you for having me.
You know, I thought about it when I was going through your book. Traditionally, we all, almost unfortunately follow into this rote routine. We talk about the body count after a mass shooting. We consider who the shooter is, the weapons they use. Then we focus on the empty and often pointless rhetoric from the electeds, some infuriating or some just, negligible if non-existent of impact. What prompted you to look at the people who weren't in the body count but were nonetheless victims of the shooting?
Well, my feeling was that I had done reporting on this in 2017 and very quickly realized for myself that the scope of this crisis was so much bigger than I had ever imagined, and even somebody who was following it pretty closely. And I wanted to deliver that to readers. So, I did focus on kids who were largely not physically harmed by this epidemic because they represent, frankly, the much, much, much larger pool of victims in this country, especially as that relates to kids. We tend to focus so narrowly on the people who get shot, whether it's in these mass shootings or in school shootings, or just, in the everyday sort of community gun violence. But the truth is that this is a crisis that affects not hundreds, not thousands of kids, but millions of children every year.
And I want with you to put a human face as you did in your book on this, but there's no debate, is there, John, that the evidence is empirical, that there is a huge emotional scar on these children, and we'll talk about 2 in particular in a minute, but there's no more debate with the amount of evidence, and sadly, with all the cases to examine, we know the trauma that's left behind.
Yeah, absolutely. When there's study after study after study that illustrates this. One that I find particularly compelling was a study out of Chicago that looked at when a homicide happens in a neighborhood. The children who live in that neighborhood, they didn't have to know the person, they didn't have to see it, they didn't have to hear it. They just had to live in that neighborhood. And in the week afterward, they did worse on their test scores. The vast majority of those homicides, overwhelming majority, are from gun violence. So, those kids are invisible when we think about the trauma of gun violence. These are kids who are totally removed from that act, and yet it's affecting their ability to do well in school. And then when you zoom that camera in a little bit to kids who maybe witness a shooting, who've lost a parent to a shooting, who've been on a campus when a shooting occurred, none of whom were shot. The trauma that those kids can endure can last for years. And I know that because I've talked to many of those children who are still years and years later dealing with debilitating PTSD.
Let's talk about two of those children, both 7 years old, one a boy, one a girl, one from a poor rural white community, one from an inner city poor black community. The boy lost his dad, the girl lost a very close friend. Let's talk about what you saw firsthand to them, their family. Start off, I guess, with Ava, if you will. Talk about what you saw and the scars that you wrote about. And you said at one point, if I got it right, John, that you've covered this for a long time. You have never been as shook as what you saw when she was having one of those episodes after the shooting.
Yeah, that's true. I wrote about that in the book. And Ava Olson is her name. She attended a small elementary school in South Carolina called Townville Elementary. One day in 2016, in the fall of 2016, a 14-year-old pulls up on this playground and gets out of his truck and opened fires on a group of first graders who had just come outside for recess. And among them was Ava. She had a cupcake in her hand and, she drops the cupcake and runs. But the boy she really loved, her best friend named Jacob Hall, he was killed. And he was the only one who died because the shooter's gun jammed in 12 seconds. That was the entirety of the shooting. That's why most of us have never heard of the school shooting at Townville Elementary, because that's how we calculate these things now. We how many kids died. In the 5 years since then, Ava has suffered from just debilitating PTSD. She had to leave school. She was diagnosed with PTSD. She's disassociates sometimes and has these really violent episodes. I've witnessed a couple, and one of which I describe in the book that lasted about half an hour. And, this isn't who she was at all. This is a thoughtful, well-read, girl who made A's and B's and is just described by everybody as this incredibly sweet kid. But that 12 seconds derailed the rest of her life. I mean, she's going to fight for the rest of her life to achieve some sort of sense of normalcy just because of that day and the after effects of it.
You go, I guess, close to our nation's capital with Tashawn, and he lost his dad. His dad was taken from him when he was only 7 years old, also at the end of a gun.
Right. So he was in second grade when I met him. And, Tyshawn, unlike Ava, he was really familiar with gun violence. This had been a big part of his life since he could remember being alive. He had once been on a playground when somebody started shooting and somebody, tackled him to the ground. Another time he was playing video games in his dad's bedroom and somebody started shooting outside and he, dove behind the bed. When I met Tyshawn, there was a bullet hole in his dad's front door. When I met him, he was in second grade. By then he knew 4 people himself who had been shot to death personally. These weren't just people he'd heard of, but he actually knew them. So, all of this had been circling his life before it finally ended his dad's life. He was shot 5 times in the middle of the day. And, for Tyshawn, he immediately dealt with anger and depression. There were times when he didn't want to be alive anymore so he could see his dad in heaven. He, though, is not unique in his community. A lot of kids, the only way we really get introduced to these kids, most of us, is through news articles that talk about the dead parent and they say father of 3 or mother of 2. But those 3s and 2s, represent enormous pain, years of pain, and sometimes kids never recover from that stuff. What makes the book, I think, pretty unique is that these 2 kids, Ava and Tyshawn, end up becoming best friends, really, because they end up bonding over this, uniquely American tragedy, and that is gun violence. And that friendship is still exists today. They write each other letters and talk on FaceTime, but it just, it should never have happened because what caused it was something that is so preventable.
John, in prepping for your book, I read Professor Hemingway, who is a professor of health policy at Harvard, but he's also the co-director of the Harvard Injury Control Research Center. And it was interesting. This is a guy surrounding it. He can have data, and as does his actual center at the tip of his fingers. But he found your book to be both moving but extremely infuriating because of the international collection of students that come into his class. None of them can understand, from the countries they come from, when there's such a human health crisis, how the adults permit it. And he found it infuriating because he really liked those kids. Like, it's impossible to walk away not feeling for him after reading your book. It's amazing. If you just listen to the kids, they seem to know better than the adults. They don't want to grow up in a world where they have to be worried about who's got a gun and who doesn't, and what they have to take matters in their own hands, possibly to even protect themselves. It's amazing the disconnect between what kids know and what adults are unwilling to do.
Yeah, I think a lot of it's intentional too, right? I mean, these kids just see, hey, you know, this thing is doing incredible harm to me and my friends and my community and my parents. Why can't we do something about it? And, you know, there's an unwillingness, I think, among many lawmakers to even acknowledge that reality. Is they have to deny that millions of children are affected, because if they acknowledged it, they would really be obligated to do something about it. But, you know, the truth is that money still plays a huge part in why we can't really get anything done on this, because, you know, the gun lobby, the NRA, they don't want new gun laws passed. They don't want any kind of restrictions on the sale of firearms. And, you know, if we research it, there might be things we find that they don't, you know, want us to find, to say, hey, this is how things can get better. I do think that there is a real disconnect between what most of America wants, what regular people want, including gun owners, and what people on Capitol Hill are willing to vote for. The overwhelming majority of Americans, including gun owners, want things like background checks, universal background checks, to get passed. They want laws that say, hey, you have to lock up your kid, your gun from your kid. Your kid can't get access to your gun. Many of these laws, right, red flag laws, a lot of them have significant support among gun owners. So America is not nearly as split on this issue as Capitol Hill is. And that's because, you know, there are senators on Capitol Hill who simply are more afraid of the gun lobby and the NRA turning on them than they are of almost anything else.
I know everyone has heard enough of numbers for guns, but one kid shot every hour. We've lost 30,000 children over the last decade to guns. And as you learn from John's book, the number is much, much bigger than that when you look at all the, you know, unfortunate collateral damage that's attached to it. John Woodrow Cox, again, the book Children Under Fire: An American Crisis. Thank you so much.
Hey, thank you for having me. This was a great conversation.
You as well. All right, everyone, we'll be right back.